Larry, we're back for another three-part series, and this one's going to be focused on gastroscopes remaining contaminated. We've talked about Candida auris, we've talked about E. coli, and multi-resistant organisms, and really the threat, or multi-drug resistant
MDROs.
organisms, and the threats. And so gastroscopes is an area, you and I have been talking about this for a while, that a lot of the focus in this area has really been on colonoscopes, but now we're going to dive into a conversation around gastroscopes. We're going to be giving some background in this first video, which is
Some
part of a
overview.
three-part series. Yep, an overview. The next one, we will dive into some analysis and work that you've done going back through a lot of the adverse event reporting. And then finally, we'll have some recommendations in the third video. So why don't you get us kicked off and give us the background on some of these adverse event reports related to gastroscopes?
So we've all been very familiar through the years with duodenoscopes, which are this complex instrument that's used to perform a certain procedure to address and diagnose diseases, for example, of the pancreatic duct. And a lot of focus has been on duodenoscopes, and I think more focus needs to additionally be on gastroscopes. And it seems to be not a topic too often that people are discussing. I have been, and I want to focus on it and discuss why I'm specifically focusing on gastroscopes and why I'm seeing some safety signals, more so that I am seeing some safety signals. And then, as you said in the third video, we'll talk about some recommendations. So in a previous video, we discussed an FDA adverse event report that was filed in November 2022, linking gastroscopes to 3 patients testing positive for what the report called a rare strain of antibiotic-resistant E. coli. So to simplify that, it's possible that that is what we've been talking about for months and years now in the press and in publications, CRE, or carbapenem-resistant Enterobacteriaceae. And if
One of
this,
the hottest topics prior to the pandemic in
yes,
infection
absolutely.
prevention across the country.
And we're going to be coming back to this now. Superbugs are going to be taking over again in the wake of the focus that was all on COVID-19. So here we found this report discussing concerns about this rare resistant strain of E. coli that, again, could be CRE if resistant to the carbapenem antibiotics. Okay, then next in the video, we discussed a December 2022 FDA adverse event report that linked a gastroscope, this time not to a resistant E. coli, but to a type of fungus that we're hearing a lot about in the press lately. A patient tested positive for the Candida auris, which is a deadly fungus that some strains of which are pan-resistant, meaning when you get infected with it, there's really no treatment for it. So now I want to discuss about a case that I discovered in the FDA's adverse event, or MAUDE, M-A-U-D-E database, that was similar to this November case. And I identified in the adverse event report, the FDA's database, a case describing 2 gastroscopes that were used on patients. And according to the report, multiple patients in this U.S. case were confirmed to have what's called NDM E. coli. And I'll talk about that very briefly. What does that mean? It sounds confusing. It's not. Some may remember that in 2014, the CDC linked an outbreak associated with the use of duodenoscopes to several patients who were infected with this same identical NDM producing E. coli. And what is it? So NDM E. coli, NDM stands for New Delhi metallobeta-lactamase producing Escherichia coli. Now that's a mouthful. In
Say
short,
that 3 times fast, exactly.
right. In short, NDM E. coli is CRE. Okay, and it means that the bacteria produces an enzyme that dismantles and hydrolyzes the antibiotic, rendering it inactive. So anytime we see CRE, we are concerned. And I want to point out that this case involving gastroscopes then was linked to similar bacteria, similar superbug that we have known about with duodenoscopes. So that's why I want to bring gastroscopes into the
How
focus
dangerous
today.
is this? I mean, because we've talked about sort of this being a big focus, previously, and it's coming back onto the radar, the forefront. I guess it's been on the radar, but it's coming to the forefront again. I mean, what are we talking about in terms of mortality rates here?
Right, good question. The mortality rates we talked about with pan-resistant Candida auris can be approaching 100%. In general, CRE infections of the bloodstream, we're looking at a mortality rate of about 50%. So as many as 1 out of 2 patients infected with CRE, whether or not it's due to a contaminated endoscope, is a very serious issue, and healthcare practitioners are running out of options. So mortality rate about 50%. This is a concern. And again, we're pointing out that gastroscopes are also a concern, just like duodenoscopes. And I think you and I have been talking about this, but it appears it may be underappreciated, this risk of gastroscopes exposing patients to CRE and related superbugs. So that's why we really want to talk about it today and in this series of videos. So as I've stressed in these videos, one of my questions that I've had is that the FDA has been recently focusing on the potential, the concern of reprocessed duodenoscopes, urological endoscopes, and even bronchoscopes remaining contaminated and exposing patients to these multi-drug resistant organisms, including CRE. So while there is precedent and that the FDA has notified the public about these 3 types of flexible endoscopes, they have not notified the public to date about the potential for gastroscopes, notwithstanding the 3 cases we just talked about in recent that were recently filed with the FDA, linking the use of gastroscopes to actual patient infections, whether it was potentially with a Candida auris or with what we called NDM E. coli or CRE. So this is something we want to keep on our radar, and we'll talk about a little bit later in our recommendations as to how the public can become more aware of this. But to date, FDA has not publicized this, and I'm recommending that they consider alerting the public to the risk, specifically of gastroscopes, the 4th type of endoscope, potentially exposing patients to CRE. And for those who may not be familiar with gastroscopes, so I'm sure everyone is, just to tie a loose end, it's an upper GI type of endoscope that we put down the mouth and we use to diagnose diseases of the esophagus primarily or of the stomach.
Yeah, Larry, I'm looking forward to coming back and talking a little bit more in depth on the analysis that you conducted, because we're going to start talking about the air and water nozzle. So those of you that are very familiar with this equipment,
Right.
And you also mentioned again the Candida auris. If you haven't checked out those videos on our YouTube channel already, it's another 3-part series really diving into it. And honestly, Larry brought it to my attention before we saw anything in the news. And so, Larry, just want to commend you for always staying way ahead of the curve on these things and looking forward. Make sure you stay with us and look out for the next video. And we're going to be discussing the analysis air water nozzle. Then in the 3rd video, we will be giving you some recommendations. So, Larry, great job today.
Thank you.